Welcome to the podcast, Amazing Tales About History, and I'm your host, Mike Allen. So who was the first one to fly? Orville and Wilbur Wright, the Wright Brothers? Right? Well, there are some who say that those honors really belong to a Bridgeport, Connecticut man, Gustave Whitehead. Now, the Wrights flew in 1903. Whitehead supposedly flew in 1901, a full 2 years ahead of that. However, the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. maintains that the Wright brothers were first. Well, our guest today has studied this story, and he's going to share all of the ins and outs of the controversy surrounding it. Eric Wolfgang has been on Amazing Tales before. He's a very talented freelance journalist whose publishing credits include Connecticut Magazine, the New York Times, the Smithsonian Magazine, and many others. He's also an adjunct professor at WestConn's Master of Fine Arts program for professional writing. Eric's going to be along in just a moment. This week's trivia question: the theme park was known as the Disneyland of the East, and it was even designed by the same man who designed the original Disneyland. Which park was it? Stay tuned after the main program for the answer. You'll have the topic for next week's show. I want you to imagine something for a moment. Think about being in your backyard, building a contraption that you would hope would fly. And then imagine the satisfaction of actually getting it up off the ground and staying airborne for maybe half a minute or longer. Now, imagine being the very first person in history to ever do that. Well, so you might say this is an episode about Orville and Wilbur Wright, who flew their homemade plane in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in 1903 and have a photograph to prove it. Well, we'll be talking about them a lot today, but the real focus is on a German immigrant from Bridgeport, Connecticut, Gustave Whitehead. Now, there are a large number of people, including the General Assembly of the State of Connecticut in Hartford, who say he beat the Wright brothers by 2 years. They say that he flew his contraption in 1901 in a field in Fairfield, not far from Long Island Sound. So why all the fuss? Shouldn't we just hand the crown over to Gustave and go on with our lives? Well, it's not that simple, and in fact, it gets pretty complicated. There are skeptics who say it didn't happen, or at least it didn't happen the way it was supposed to have happened, based on a newspaper article and a small group of supposed eyewitnesses. The story now is nearly 125 years old, but as you'll hear, the controversy is far from settled. With us today to go through the background is Eric Wolfgang. He's a freelance journalist who's written for Connecticut Magazine, the New York Times, and importantly for today's episode, Smithsonian Magazine. So, Eric, I would have to say that anybody coming up through school learns about the Wright brothers. First people to fly, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. It kind of rolls off your tongue. You learn that as a kid. But let's just assume for the sake of this question that Gustave Whitehead beat the Wright brothers and was the first to fly. We don't know a heck of a lot about him. Now, you do because you've done the research. I just, he was a German immigrant that somehow ended up in Bridgeport and loved all these things about flying back in the 1800s. Tell us what we don't know about Gustave Whitehead's background.
He's one of these early kind of aviation enthusiasts and also inventors of the era that I just kind of love, where they're sort of largely self-taught people who kind of bootstrap these investigations and are trying to do things on their own. So he's definitely this classic sort of poor inventor. He's not associated with any institution. Very little is known about his research and about what he may or may not have accomplished.
When you look at the old movies, I guess you would call them movies, of, the first real attempts to fly, and you see wings flapping like birds and, these things falling off cliffs and whatnot. I think he may have built one of these, right? Something called the ornithopter. What can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so he definitely built this contraption that, looks exactly, like something out of those old movies. I think as a kid, I watched Those Magnificent Men and their flying machines. And in the beginning, you see, just all these attempts at flight that do not work. And you're like, wow, someone got on that thing. And Gustave Whitehead's airplane or plane, if you could call it that, definitely had that appearance. Kind of like a canoe with sort of wings on it. a sailboat that was a small kind of rickety sailboat that was, designed to fly. And he said he based the design on a bird or a bat. And you could really kind of see that. You could see its sort of bird-like appearance, and it's this kind of early primordial kind of attempt at flight.
And when you stop and think about it, it makes sense. You're looking at birds flying, so you figure you've got to repeat that. And that's, I think, what a lot of the early folks did. Now, finally, in the very, very early part of 1900s, like 1901, it's the summer, it's August 14th, and he's built this contraption called the number 21 Condor. And we know about this because of an article that appeared in the Bridgeport Sunday Herald. And we'll get into the newspaper coverage of this separately in just a second, but let's just assume all of this from the article is right. It is a great story, and if you could just sort of encapsulate what is said to have happened on that day, August 14th, starting from where this guy's holding the rope as the plane is getting ready to take off, and they want to give it as much thrust as possible. So they've got a guy actually holding a rope, holding back the plane before it could take off. From that point, tell us what we know about that supposed flight that day.
Yeah, so the account is it's this really incredible scene of Gustave Whitehead and his two assistants taking this aircraft out. He's looking at his clock and waiting for the right moment. The engine starts and the assistants are holding the ropes not to let it get away, which I just kind of love that imagery of this plane that the wind is trying to pick up. He starts flying in it. He tells them quite dramatically to let her go, and he takes off. And he apparently, if the report is to believe, completes in that moment what would be the first controlled flight of an airplane. It would be quite a momentous moment for human history.
Now, anybody who wants to open up Google Maps and try and figure out where this happened, this was supposedly in the town of Fairfield, about a mile or so north of Jennings Beach. And at the time, there was a place there, I think they called it Turney Farm or something like this, the back of Fairfield. And it was, I think, selected because there were a couple of open fields that kind of went down so he could get a running start on this. And he supposedly was airborne for, I think, half a mile. Is that right?
A fair amount of time. I forget the exact amount. I don't think there's any dispute. There's a lot of dispute about Whitehead, but there's no dispute that if it happened the way described in this newspaper article, that would be a controlled flight. I think there's some dispute as if that occurred, or there definitely is some dispute, but there's no dispute that what is described would be a true flight. There's this great line in the article when, Whitehead shouts to his assistants to let go of the ropes. It says they let go, and as they did so, the machine darted up through the air like a bird released from a cargo. And you just get this image of this kind of what we would see today as a makeshift craft just shooting up into the air in this sort of spectacular way.
Now, you're a journalist. I'm a former journalist. We like facts. We like to see things. We like to understand that things happened. And I guess one of the problems with this is that there's no photograph like the Wright Brothers had. The other thing is what we really know about that day and that flight and everything you just recounted came from a Bridgeport Sunday Herald newspaper article. And let's talk about several different aspects of what is perhaps questionable about that article, starting off with the fact that it was published 4 days after the event. Could you explain why that happened?
When I looked into this, that was kind of to me like the key piece of evidence. It was kind of, if this account is true, this really happened. If it's not true, then I don't think there's enough evidence to say he flew. And so what I set out to do was sort of say, okay, let's take a really close look at this story and see if there's reason to doubt it or reason to believe it. Let's see why this could be fake news or real news. And, one of the claims that has been repeated against it is that, if it was such big news, why did they wait 4 days? And that's one that you see a lot, even, today. When this controversy came back up a number of years ago in the 2010s, when Connecticut passed the first in flight legislation, you even heard people at the Smithsonian saying, well, it wasn't a serious news story because they waited 5 days. But the thing about that is that was one of the easy parts. Well, they waited 5 days because it was a weekly. So that was the first issue after the flight. And they carried this story, as soon as this publication could.
And you're right. We're talking as if the flight actually happened. And if it did, it happened on a Wednesday. And the Bridgeport paper, a weekly, came out the following Sunday. And that was indeed when it was published. Now, question number two about that, though, and I know you as a journalist, your ears would perk up over this. They ran the story on page 5. What do we know about that?
Yes. Yeah, well, generally speaking, you would put the biggest news stories on the front page. And this would be, arguably one of the biggest news stories of all time, certainly looking back on it. So, that, unlike the waiting, does raise some suspicion. Now, what's interesting about that is there's some debate about this. And one of the reasons this could be, strong emphasis on that word, it's sort of only in retrospect that people in the general public realized how important the distinction was between lighter than air flight, which is, a balloon, a dirigible, and heavier than air flight, which is an airplane. These sort of nutty things and impressive things with balloons. And for the general public and even a reporter, it may have been hard to tell the difference between these different types of aerial phenomena. Today, it's so clear that a plane is a very different thing to us than a balloon. At the time, there was different flying machines, and this was one more like that. And it was pretty exciting. The newspaper devoted a lot of time to it. They didn't necessarily realize that it was as sort of earth-shattering as we would understand in retrospect.
Now, I'm just going to raise a point because you are a journalist and get your opinion on this, because I read it as a former journalist and thought, here's an article that, like you say, could have been one of the largest news stories ever, and it appeared without a byline. Now, this was in August, and in November, the paper ran another front page story, this time a front page story, and they identified who the guy was who wrote the article. But the reason why I think this is so important is that a lot of the article is written in the first person, right? Because he was an eyewitness to the event and he said what he saw. So did you find that curious as well?
Bylines were a little less common back at that time. And, one way it could have happened, and it's at least plausible to me, it's such a well-written story. It's a lot of fun to read the whole story. I would want my byline on it at the time, for sure. One reason they might not have put it on is it could have been like, send out this reporter to see this quirky inventor, local inventor, see what happens. Maybe it'll go really bad. Maybe nothing will happen. But either way, it'll be kind of this fun, quirky story. Lo and behold, it goes really well. They still have the place assigned for it. The extent of how well doesn't translate to the editors. But what does happen is, as the weeks go on, more newspapers cover it. Like you said, they run information about Whitehead. They refer to the story. They don't recant it. They don't say, you know what, our reporter misunderstood what they saw, or we sent out a cub reporter, or they don't say like, our bad, we misreported the facts. They say this happened, and we're starting to realize, they don't actually say this, but it's implied that we're starting to realize it was a bigger deal than even we thought.
And without, just focusing too heavily on the Bridgeport Sunday Herald and saying, all good, all bad, or whatever, other newspapers that came down and interviewed Gustave Whitehead included the New York Sun, the Boston Globe, the Washington Times, and the Boston Journal. And he gave interviews to all of them, and none of them said he was a quack. So I that's interesting, too. So now, with all this as background, we now forward to I guess you would call him the referee in this debate, the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. And, the Smithsonians have made a very, strong statement that the Wright brothers were the first to fly. And this comes in two parts, and let's take these separately. First is, what is the sort of reason for doubting that Gustave Whitehead did this?
One of the things that they say that I think that it's troubling is that this section of the paper on the page 5 of the Bridgeport Sunday Herald tended to feature sort of quirky, outlandish stories that may or may not be true, sort of almost kind of tabloid style stories. There was a story about the Winstead Wildman. There was a story about a thief or something in the weeks before and after. And so that kind of, didn't look great. This story was different. It had an eyewitness account. There are reasons that you could point to that are different, but there's certainly reasons to say that there's something different about this section than some of the other stories in the paper. And I think you can make that argument. I think that's a fair argument to make. Also, even after I wrote the story, as I sort of learned more about aviation history and follow-up work, I think there's something interesting about the way in which, the Wright brothers kind of inarguably, they were the ones that created the path towards modern aviation and modern aircraft. Gustave Whitehead's role in history, well, I think it's significant and deserves to be looked at if indeed he flew. And even if he didn't, because he was a person who was getting news and spreading information and conducting these different experiments, deserves a place in history. He wasn't the one that perfected flight. Even if he did it, he didn't perfect it. And I think that's something that the Wright brothers can lay claim to, and the historic record is pretty clear on.
One of the other things that, and I think I read this in your article, or I've read it somewhere, that years later in the 1930s, there was a journalist named Stella Randolph who did an investigation into Whitehead, and as part of her book on her research findings, she actually got affidavits from people who said, hey, I saw him fly, blah, blah, blah. But the Smithsonian, if I understand it correctly, says there have been some discrepancies, maybe minor, in what these eyewitnesses saw. What can you tell us about this?
No one doubts that he got flights off the ground, that he, might have gotten into the air a little bit. If you were 5 years old or 8 years old and saw a plane go up in the air 20 years later, it's conceivable that you could remember that being a lot higher than it was, or taking turns in a different way. So there's, eyewitness testimony years later can always be somewhat suspect. You could always call into question, memory isn't perfect. There was also some question about one of the assistants that was there claimed it never happened. He had a signed affidavit and said that the story was made up. He wasn't there. And that's something that the camp that's, sort of the Wright camp points to. What's sort of interesting about that, though, is they sort of are being very selective in the testimony they take, because the other assistant who was there said it did happen, as well as many other people interviewed by that journalist said it did happen. This assistant also said he was mad at Gustave Whitehead because Whitehead owed him money and never paid him.
There's another part to the Smithsonian story, and I'd just like you to sort of button this up because, again, when you first hear about this, you go, aha, there's the smoking gun. And this is this guy, Bill O'Dwyer from Fairfield. He was a historian, a former Air Force pilot, and I guess he was asked by the Connecticut Aeronautical Historical Society to look into the whole Gustave Whitehead thing, and he assembled some facts, and at first I guess he was pretty skeptical. Then he got convinced. He went to the Smithsonian. They said, no way. And then he found out about the agreement. And tell us about this agreement between the Smithsonian and Orville and Wilbur Wright's estate, and why that at first smells pretty funny, but maybe is not as bad as it seems.
In 1948, in exchange for being able to display the Wright Flyer, the Smithsonian made an agreement that they would recognize the Wright brothers as first in flight, or forfeit the Wright Flyer, that they would uphold that and not accept any claims to the contrary. In addition to Whitehead, there are other claims of flights that predate the Wright brothers.
Now, hadn't they been working with a guy who was trying to undo the Wright brothers and said there was another thing called the Aerodrome by Langley that would have been capable of flight, and the Smithsonian sided with them?
Yes, and Samuel Langley worked at the Smithsonian. He had built this aircraft. After his death, friends of his put it together based on his plans and attempted to fly it, and were able to do so at least semi-successfully. And they then made the claim that this plane predated the Wright brothers and was capable of flight. It is a very contentious claim. They made the duplicate many years later, and it's unclear if the materials would have been the same or available. I mean, it also is kind of after the fact. So that was something the Wright brothers and the Smithsonian had been arguing about for a while. This can be seen as sort of the terms between the Wright brothers and the Smithsonian to say, okay, we're not going to be pursuing that claim anymore.
So basically, the Smithsonian said, let us show your plane off, and we will say that you were first in flight. And so this guy from Fairfield finds this out. It looks horrible, but when you dig down into the background, you understand why they did that. And that really doesn't have to do so much with Gustave Whitehead and whether or not he flew. But there is something, and I want to wrap this up on this point, which was, I guess, in 2013, a very respected aviation publication, Jane's All the World's Aircraft. Anybody who knows about aviation knows the name Jane's. And so this is something they wrote an editorial back in 2013. And they asserted in that editorial that Whitehead had beaten the Wright brothers. And this led to Connecticut passing a resolution recognizing Connecticut as first in flight, which, of course, North Carolina and Ohio, the home of the Wright brothers, disputed. So is this ever going to end?
It's funny, and there is continued debate. It's really hard to prove one way or another. I will say that serious aviation historians often get kind of frustrated with the Whitehead thing. They feel that it's overblown and takes up too much oxygen in the conversation. But I think for the reasons we talked about, it's definitely not outside the realm of possibility. I disagree with the Whitehead proponents that it's a clear cut case, and anyone who disagrees is in the pocket of the Smithsonian that has this agreement. It must be something kind of conspiratorial going on. I disagree with that, but I do think that there's an argument to be made that the evidence sort of suggests that this is at least plausible. I would say that.
Gustave Whitehead was a family man and not a businessman with lots of money. He struggled to even feed his family, and in fact, it turns out when he died penniless. Well, that wraps up this episode of Amazing Tales About History. Well, don't expect this controversy to fade away anytime soon. When the Connecticut legislature declared the state first in flight, the legislatures of North Carolina, where the Wright brothers flew their plane, and Ohio, which was the Wright brothers' home base of operations, immediately signaled their opposition. I want to thank our guest for today's program, freelance journalist and WestConn adjunct professor Eric Aufgang, who's been published in Connecticut Magazine, the New York Times, and Smithsonian Magazine. And he teaches at WestConn's Masters of Fine Arts program for professional writing. The answer to this week's trivia question, the question was, this theme park was known as the Disneyland of the East, and it was even designed by the same man who designed the original Disneyland. Which park was it? The answer, Freedomland in the Bronx, an incredible theme park that was only open from 1960 to 1964 and is now the location for Co-op City. Next week on Amazing Tales, what's even more incredible than the park itself is the unbelievable backstory behind its demise. We're going to have the story for you with the foremost living expert on the former Freedomland Park. Amazing Tales About History is a production of True North Associates, LLC. This is Mike Allen. Be safe and stay healthy.